Hello and welcome back to The Distracted Gardener. I'm Charlie. I hope this episode finds you well. Before we hop into the topic of the day, I want to mention something that I think will be really beneficial to those among you striving to be successful as organic vegetable gardeners. Joel Ample, the Joe behind the Joe Gardener podcast, is holding the Joe Gardener Organic Vegetable Gardening Summit from March 26th through the 29th, of course, of this year, basically this week. The summit breaks down into the following topics. March 26th is the fundamentals of organic vegetable gardening and why it matters. March 27th, setting up your planting season by planning ahead. March 28th, setting up your garden to go the distance despite the challenges. And March 29th, live Q&A session and finale. All sessions will be held via Zoom and are free to participate in. You just need to sign up on the Joe Gardener website, a link to which I'll provide in the show notes. I am a huge fan of the Joe Gardener podcast. I've been listening to it every single week since I started gardening. I believe Joe to be a trustworthy source on the topic, so I will be joining in the sessions, though given that they kick off at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is, what is it now? Maybe 2 a.m. for me here in Japan. I may be checking out the recorded versions after the fact. But either way, whether you want to join live or you want to check out the recorded versions after, if you go and follow the link again, that's going to be in the show notes. You can sign up and probably get access. Well, you'll be able to get access to what will probably be some really useful information. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into today's topic, GMO seeds. So I was listening to the latest episode of the Joe Gardener podcast. I feel like I should point out that I have no relation to it other than just being a really big fan. Joe and his guest, Craig Hoolier, who's like a renowned tomato expert. I think he wrote the book called Growing Epic Tomatoes. They got briefly into the subject of GMOs when Craig brought up the Purple Galaxy tomato, seeds for which were apparently briefly sold by Baker Creek Seeds in the States under the belief that they were non-GMO. But long story short, it turns out that the seed may actually be related to a GM tomato produced by big ag company Norfolk. Joe and Craig only briefly touched on their feelings about the Purple Galaxy and GMOs, but it was enough to get my brain working. In a nutshell, right, to put it simply, I think I'm against GMOs, And in all honesty, when I started to think about it, I found that belief is one that comes basically from the gut. And it's not something I've examined all that much until now. I want to take you with me as I sort of explore that feeling, though, and see if it doesn't lead us someplace. I think the first big thing that sticks out to me is that we don't really know how screwing with something on the genetic level will affect the ecosystem, the insects, birds, etc., that will have access to a crop we grow, right? This is sort of fresh in my mind. I was just out in the garden and found what I think to be a caterpillar of one of the hawk moth species, and we often see adult hawk moths over the summertime here, and it was munching on my anemones out there. So yeah, in those kind of situations, right, if that were a genetically modified anemone, for example, would there be any sort of negative effect on that insect, for example, that would not be present if it was just your run-of-the-mill anemone, right? At the top of the episode, I mentioned Norfolk's purple tomato. Apparently, that tomato gets its color and an increased level of anthocyanins, the antioxidants that make blueberries so good for you, from an inserted Snapdragon gene. Kind of recently, I guess. For example, the Black Beauty tomato, and also the Atomic Grape tomato, right? Both of them, I think, are from a guy by the name of Indigo Brad. They're varieties of tomatoes, and both of those have some kind of strange coloration, and especially the Black Beauty has a heightened level of anthocyanins, and so I imagine it changes the flavor, and it definitely changes the look of the tomato. It gives it this sort of the outside this really beautiful dark purple color, while the inside remains kind of a deep red. I grow them. I'm going to grow them again this year. Actually, I can see the seedling from where I'm sitting. But yeah, that's what gives the tomatoes their color in those situations. It's hard to imagine how that change to the purple tomato, right? The adding of the Snapdragon gene will detrimentally impact the wildlife that pollinate those tomato flowers. Also, the soil that tomatoes are grown in, to say nothing of how that gene change might affect people who eat the tomatoes. It's a matter that needs to be studied. It is worth pointing out that, at least so far, a lot of the studies that you see in the case of approaching this topic fairly seem to show that there are no findable, at least, immediate effects to at least consuming the fruit from genetically modified plants. So that's something to keep in mind, I suppose, and something we'll touch on a little bit later. It's much easier to imagine a negative wide-ranging impact when you talk about other GMOs, like BT producing corn, for example. Now, BT you may have heard about if you're sort of been around in sort of the organic space for a while, but it is a kind of naturally occurring bacterium in soil that has insecticidal properties. There's various strains. Some of them are super general in that they affect a wide variety of insects. Others are very species specific, or I suppose it would be more, what would you put it, family specific. Depending on the strain, again, it can kill butterflies, moths, flies, beetles, and other types of insects. It's, again, often used by organic gardeners. I know that, for instance, in my case, I've never used it, but my first line of defense, first of all, when I see some kind of pest, is some kind of mechanical control. So, for instance, if I see aphids are on something, I'll blast them off with a hose, or, failing that, I know something I've had a lot of success with basically every year that I've gardened. Again, this is my 4th year, is setting up enough, for example, flowers and things that particularly like ladybugs, right, like, so that they'll come and they'll help control the pests for me. It's an example of integrated pest management, I suppose. But this BT, right, this bacteria, is used when the mechanical pest control or integrated pest management fail to control those pest species. And I have to say, again, I've never used it myself, but I can't say that I'm against using it sparingly. Sometimes, how can I say? I don't know. My feeling on it is of course it shouldn't be something that you go to right away. Again, you want to use those other methods first, but I feel like it's a much better option than pouring some kind of highly toxic pesticide or whatever on your plants, in a variety of meanings, right? So yeah, as I say, I'm not against it when it's used in those situations. That's kind of the only answer, I suppose. But I do think it's troubling to think of crops that can produce their own BT and are constantly killing insects, whether they're harming the plant or not. And that's not some kind of science fiction kind of thing. This is the case for BT modified corn, for instance, that have these different kinds of corn have had BT genes inserted into their own DNA. So basically what they do is they produce the bacteria, or the effects that the bacteria would produce on those insects, killing them off, right? Whether they're a problem or not. So it's just sort of like, how would you even say that? What would be the correct way to put it? I suppose if we go back to the early 2000s, right, it'd be like, oh God, what's that word? Anyway, strike first before you know whether anybody's going to strike you, kind of thing, right? I'm struggling to think about a George Bush line, but I guess it's best if I don't remember anyway. This might be a good place to play devil's advocate. Genetic modification of crops is taking desirable traits and infusing them into a new version of a tomato or corn, whatever the case may be. Because of this tinkering, we may wind up with crops that can stand up to more radical weather, something we will doubtlessly need in the years to come. Crops that can produce fruit or edibles, right, with less water, stand up better to pest pressure, whatever the case may be. And again, as I said before, at least so far, there have not been any definitive studies, at least according to a cursory search that I did before recording the episode, that definitively show that there's any sort of great impact from consuming GMO vegetables and fruits in that nature. If you have links to a study or something like that I did not find, I of course would love for you to share that with me so I can read it and better educate myself. Now, if we look on hybridization, on the other hand, right, people who are advocates for GMOs often say that GMO is basically just a fast track to hybridization, right? And hybridization is also taking desirable traits and infusing them into a new version of a tomato, corn, etc. However, of course, hybrids don't inspire the same sort of volatile reaction as GMOs do. Are they not the same? Right? If the end goal, I suppose, from a bird's eye view is that they're the same, right? You get more desirable traits, you get a new stronger version of a plant, stronger in quotation marks. Are they not the same? And at least for me, I would say they're not. Hybridization is using what nature would already do for itself and just basically accelerating the process, right? Imagine the brassica family, right? Broccolis, kales, cabbages, Brussels sprouts, right? And all the other things that are in the brassica family. These things, you can imagine a situation where all or some of these things would have been created naturally over time, right? Through some sort of fitness that they demonstrated, right? And that would be, with or without human guidance. I think, on the other hand, you would be harder pressed to imagine Snapdragon genes making their way in tomatoes over time, just as part of this natural process of plants interbreeding and then creating something new, right? Hybrids have to work within that system of fitness, I think. And on the other hand, GMOs, it seems, do not, right? They sort of exist outside of sort of that natural check and balances of the natural world. Now, one great source of ecological damage stemming from the use of GMOs is that they play a part in the overuse of herbicides. And I guess herbicides is a little bit too limiting, that word. We can use the word biocides, right? Including fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, all those things that just kill off stuff that we don't want, basically. And the reason for that is that, for instance, resistant GMO crops are planted, that is, crops that are resistant to the effects of herbicides, for example. And then fields are sprayed with high doses of those chemicals, leaving only the GMO-resistant crops behind, right? Because they're the only ones who have that sort of built-in, or I suppose installed would be a better word to use, resistance to that chemical. And, of course, I suppose you could make an argument that would be okay if chemicals stayed in the area, right? That they're only affecting the crops that are being grown or whatever, right? And then therefore they're only affecting the people that are directly related to that crop. However, runoff from this spraying finds itself into outlying areas, wreaking havoc on ecosystems, killing off native species of what we would consider weeds, but also things that are just sort of existing, right? They're very important parts of ecosystems for insects and for a wide variety of different animals. And much in the same way that overuse of antibiotics leads to superbugs that affect animal populations, including the human animal, overuse in this way of different biocides leads to resistant weeds, super resistant insects. So, right, we have this kind of like arms race that we're sort of creating for ourselves by engaging in these practices. Where then does this leave us? It's easy to say that we need to avoid GMO seeds, but apparently very few of those actually find their way into the general consumer market, so it's probably not something like I'm going to go and be able to buy, right, like off my local nursery's shelf, that kind of thing. But what I think you can say is that we need to be mindful of what we buy as far as fruit and vegetables and the products made from them. Particularly, right, if you are one to, you love potato chips or whatever, like junk food, like highly processed foods, highly processed foods, it's more likely, apparently, that GMO things are going to be inside of that. And so, if you buy something that uses GMO products, that trickles down to GMOs having a demand. And so that means that more things are going to be grown and produced in that way. As far as seeds go, right, I think the best thing you can do to be sure you're getting seed that you can feel safe using is to source from companies that you can trust, right? Even if it is the case that you're probably not going to be able to get your hands on too many genetically modified seeds, right? For those in Japan, I recommend the Greenfield Project. I've been using that service for the last 3 years. I don't think I knew about them. 3.5 years, right? In the fall of my first season, I found them, and I've been using them. They have a wide variety of seeds that I think they're producing for themselves and sourcing for themselves. But then there are a number of products that they carry on there that are from Europe and have been certified as non-GMO by the non-GMO the non-GMO project, which we'll talk about a little bit more. In the States, Botanical Interests seems a pretty good bet. They are, generally, I think it's a good idea to look for seed companies that have signed the Safe Seed Pledge and are those that have been looked into and verified by the non-GMO project, which, at least in the case of Botanical Interests, I think I'd have to look into it for the Greenfield project. They have done both of those things. If you aren't sure of a company's status, one easy way to tell is by looking for the non-GMO verified project verification marker. It's like a flower and a butterfly that can be found on seed packets. And also, going back to selecting the food that you eat. Sometimes, for example, on bread, like even here in Japan at Costco, there'll be bread that has the non-GMO project verified marker on the package. If you don't already, it's a really good idea, of course, to save your own seeds. This will save you a lot of money in the long run. It's much more eco-friendly, right? There's nobody having to ship you any seeds or ship the seeds to the nursery that you then go drive to buy the seeds and blah, blah, blah. But it also ensures you know what is in the seeds you're working with, right? The best, of course, you have to start someplace. So, I would say start with something organic that's non-GMO verified and save those seeds year after year. And then, it seems like you'd be in a pretty good spot if you do it that way. For me, having thought about my own reasons for being against GMOs, I feel confident that I hold that opinion for rational reasons. I wonder if you found my reasons to be convincing or not, and whether you have anything to add to the conversation. If you feel there's something I left out on either side of the argument, I of course would like to hear about that. You can get at me on the usual social channels, Twitter, Insta, and Threads, all at Natural Fukui. Thanks a lot for listening to today's episode. If you're interested in more content from me, you can check out the aforementioned social channels, head to naturalfukui.com, or you can check out the Natural Fukui YouTube channel, which has recently woken up from a very lengthy hibernation. On that note, see you next week.